announce the next speaker, who's from the Science and Technology Policy Research Unit, Peru. This is Caitriona McLeish. She's a senior fellow at SPRU, and she joined the Harvard-Sussex program quite some time ago, in 1996, on chemical and biological weapons, and became its Sussex director in 2010. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in History and Philosophy of Science from the University College London, and a Master's of Science and Doctorate in Science and Technology Policy from SPRU. And she's been very much interested in dual use problems in both the chemical and biological warfare environment, and she's currently leading on a 3-year project examining how new developments in science and technologies are and might in future be reviewed for the Biological Weapons Convention.
Thanks very much. I'm going to do something a little bit radical, and I'm not going to use PowerPoint. But I think I'm also going to do something quite sensible and not pretend to be Kathy Roth from the WHO, who was due to speak on this panel. But thinking about Kathy Roth and the WHO allowed me to remember that it was back in 1970 that the WHO released its first set of technical guidance, including health aspects, of one particular type of health threat, namely the deliberate use of certain toxic chemicals and diseases as weapons of war. It seemed wise to do it at that time because states had been heavily investing in that type of weaponry, such that by the time of the first edition, 1970, state-level CBW programs, chemical biological warfare programs, had produced or made ready for weaponization a range of toxic chemicals and diseases for use on the battlefield. These included nerve agents, designed to interfere with the transmission of nerve signals at the synapses, blood agents that inhibit the ability of blood cells to utilize and transfer oxygen, choking agents, which cause the alveoli to secrete a constant flow of fluid into the lungs, and a really rather nightmarish list of diseases that include yellow fever, Ebola, dengue fever, malaria, cholera, dysentery, the plagues, West Nile fever, African swine fever, rinderpest, foot and mouth disease virus, as well as diseases capable of destroying staple crops such as potatoes, soybeans, sugar, beets, cotton, wheat and rice. It also seemed wise for them to issue this guidance at the time for the 2 international treaties that we now know as the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention, which obligate state parties to forego these types of weapons, to assist any state who is threatened by the use of toxic chemicals or diseases in this way, and to enable the transfer of relevant science and technology between member states for their own pursuit of development, as long as it's for permissive purposes, had neither entered into force, nor in the case of the Chemical Weapons Convention, had it been negotiated. My colleague at the Harvard-Sussex program, Julian Perry-Robinson, was the executive director of the 1970 WHO guidance, and he played that role again 30 years later when the WHO commissioned an update of the technical guidance to reflect the changing science and technology and geopolitical situation. The underlying thesis in both sets of guidance is the same. Chemical and biological warfare exploits particular types of scientific and technological know-how. In chemical warfare, what's exploited is the knowledge of how certain chemicals, whose primary effects comes from the toxicity of their active ingredients, affect the life processes of humans, animals and plants to cause death, temporary incapacitation or permanent harm. In biological warfare, what's particularly exploited is understandings of the nature of disease, of the properties of biological agents and toxins that cause it, as well as knowledge about the interaction between disease-causing agents and their host populations of humans, animals and plants. But at the same time as opening up new opportunities to further the development of chemical biological weapons, exactly the same scientific and technological know-how and associated technologies is essential to defend against their use. In fact, in the long term, it's essential to lessen the attractiveness of these weapons because it alters the utility calculation. The way the authors of both sets of guidance argued to lessen the attractiveness of these weapons was to invest in public health. Rather than investing in what they called back in 1970 very large and essentially wasteful efforts that would be involved in undertaking elaborate defences, their approach, their suggested approach, was to invest in certain measures within the framework of existing public health needs and resources that would redound to the benefit of health and preventative medical activities currently underway. These included, they said, the improvement of rapid detection and diagnostic facilities, improved medical management for natural disasters, including decontamination, and the wider use of safety features in buildings and for communal water supplies. Considering how we now conceive of deliberate use, not as separate but part of a wider spectrum of health threats, that also include natural outbreaks and accidental releases. The 1970 guidance in particular is classic, and it's a timeless piece of writing. I think the timelessness was achieved by stripping back the relationship between science and technology and chemical and biological weapons to its core. Because whatever the decade, whomever the potential user, whatever the environment of potential use, it remains a truth that certain types of science and technology are required both to allow use, to further opportunities of use, but also to defend against it. This is what we call the dual use problem. But the dilemma that's created by the dual use problem is how are we to ensure that science and technology for the latter requirement, the reducing the attractiveness, the defending against their use, to progress without the former, whilst ensuring that the former exploitation is not allowed to occur. It's this issue of duality that I want to consider in my remaining minutes, because I think, if anything, the dilemma that has been created by it has gotten more difficult as science and technology has progressed. I want you to think, for example, about the moment that the 1970 guidance was released. It was written before the first rDNA molecule. It was written before the first successful DNA cloning experiments. It was before the genome of bacteriophage FX134 was sequenced. But it's that moment of science that is also captured in the Biological Weapons Convention that entered into force into 1975. Just consider how much science and technology has progressed from those times. What we now consider to be a routine, what we now consider to be achievable compared to back then, how quickly we can do work and how much we take it for granted now. Yet is there an agreed upon definition for dual use? No. The shorthand ways in which we get away with referring to it, such as science and technology that can be used for hostile and peaceful purposes, mask enormous issues, and yet we still use it. In our current climate, it's the potential use of chemical and biological weapons by non-state actors which seems to preoccupy. Despite the issue being a concern many years before 9/11 and the anthrax letters which followed shortly thereafter, and work within the scientific community to guard against this particular type of misuse, beginning way before 9/11 and the anthrax letters, it was those events that saw the issue of bioterrorism skyrocket up the risk portfolios of many of the countries in the north. Use of chemicals was all but forgotten, which is slightly ironic considering what we're now seeing. Presentation of the issue of biological weapons use was not framed in terms of if biological weapons will be Instead, it was presented as, when again are they going to be used? And there seemed to be no end of rogue states and terrorists that were lined up as willing to use them if they got their hands on them. Rushed in or quickly amended in those 2 years was a series of legislation and initiatives that were launched to tackle the issue of biological weapons preventing their use by terrorists. Some of it was poorly conceived, and unfortunately, some of them also contain embedded assumptions which are unhelpful, such as advancing biology is widening the ability of disease to be put to hostile use, and their increased availability of dual-use technologies is also increasing the likelihood of use. And as major investment in countermeasure programs began, at least in some countries, the idea seemed to gain traction that biological weapons and the threat that they pose should be treated as very separate health threats. Yet it's our contention as a programme, the Harvard-Sussex programme, that the sorts of conflict areas in which we're likely to see the use of chemical and biological weapons is unlikely to occur in the countries of the north, in the countries that were having the major investment in the countermeasures programme. Instead, they're likely to be seen as occurring in failing states, which don't tend to be in the north. I think, however, that in 2014, despite the recent eruptions of tension between the security community and the scientific community, if you'll give me the latitude to use those two terms, we're in a far better place than we were in 2001, 2002. Part of this reason is because there has been a gradual carving out of middle ground between the two communities, at least by some. Much like the thesis of the WHO guidance, both editions, the middle ground frames biological weapons and the threats that they pose not as separate, but as part of a broader spectrum of health-related threats that need to be dealt with, but that the potential consequences of misuse of the life sciences in this particular way are potentially too severe to dismiss or to ignore. One way that the middle ground is manifesting itself is through a web of prevention approach, which expressly acknowledges that states can't deal with this problem on their own. And it links up and uses existing capabilities and information that were generated for quite different but complementary purposes to help reassure against backsliding and to be called upon should there be an event of use. The web also allows room for bottom-up activities through the linking of the international to the individual. Some of these bottom-up activities include journal editors designing voluntary guidelines pertaining to the publishing of certain information, certain funding agencies requiring assessment before approval of funding and throughout the project, the development of codes of conduct and awareness raising and education efforts. These are excellent, but they still require that you know actually what dual use is, that somehow you can recognise it when you see it. Quite a tall order when there isn't agreed upon definition. How is it that we're to expect scientists or funders or editors or reviewers to be guided to identify whether work is dual use and act accordingly if we can't provide a coherent definition of what dual use is? One attempt to do this has been done in the US by the introduction of the category dual use research of concern, which is defined as research based on current understanding that can be reasonably anticipated to provide knowledge, products or technology that can be directly misapplied by others to pose a threat, ... To help guide scientists performing or wishing to perform this type of research and to encourage them to think about the conduct and communication of it, 7 criterion were put forward, which was based on an earlier list of 7 experiments of concern. The clashes that we've seen since 2003, which include Venter's synthesis of the virus, synthesis and study of the 1918 influenza, mathematical modelling of the spread of botulinum and toxin in the US milk supply, and the more recent gain-of-function projects all fit within one of these 7 categories. The fact that clashes are still occurring suggests that although we may be in a better place, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. The Dirk definition, for example, is okay, but it too breezes over major problems, and by using the phrase current understanding, assumes a level of knowledge and understanding of dual use which I think is unfair, although unfair is not a waiver for being ignorant. For example, how many of you can tell me, either because you know or because you can figure it out for yourselves, what the categories of experiments which trigger Dirk, dual use research of concern? So, we have uneven knowledge. We have even uneven interest in the issue of dual use and the threats that are posed by biological weapons. Not yet, I would argue, do we have sufficient awareness, and perhaps more importantly, there's also uneven application when dual use research of concern has been identified. Why, for example, were the recent gain-of-function experiments regarded as so concerning, yet experiments involving aerosolized Ebola virus infection didn't receive the same amount of public attention? I can offer a few reasons why, but I simply don't know. To provide insight for development of medical countermeasures against Ebola virus acquired by the aerosol route is a worthy pursuit, absolutely. But I have to believe, in fact I need to believe, that the scientists that were involved in those experiments were acutely aware of the implications of aerosolizing Ebola virus. I need to believe that both they and the institutions took and continue to take all conceivable steps to prevent either accidental release or deliberate release. So it's on that perhaps rather strange and slightly worrying note, maybe, that I end in the hope that what I've started is a discussion rather than it being the end of this conference's consideration of one particular type of misuse of the life sciences.